The courthouse in the small American town stood like a monument to order and tradition. Its stone columns, weathered by decades of storms and seasons, loomed over the front steps where people gathered that morning, whispering and speculating about the case inside. It wasn't every day that the community found itself divided, sitting in judgment not over a person, but over a police dog, a creature many saw as a hero, and others saw as a dangerous threat. Inside, the air felt unusually tense. The wooden pews of the gallery were filled with townsfolk who had come to watch, some out of curiosity, others out of loyalty to the police department, and still others out of sympathy for the family who claimed to have been wronged. Every movement, the shuffle of shoes, the tapping of pens, the rustling of papers seemed magnified by the quiet expectation hanging over the room. The defense table was neatly arranged, files stacked precisely, a sign of their confidence in the case. The lead attorney, a sharp-featured man in his 40s, leaned back in his chair with the cool assurance of someone who believed the law was firmly on his side. At the prosecution's table sat a determined young woman, her eyes scanning the jury box with the kind of intensity that came from both passion and pressure. For her, this case wasn't just about law, it was about truth, about what had really happened on that day when the K-9 unit was called into action. And then there was the family, seated quietly in the gallery, not far from the front. They looked out of place among the lawyers, officers, and journalists. The father sat stiffly, his jaw set, while the mother held their 3-year-old child close to her chest, as though the courtroom itself was too sharp, too harsh for someone so small. The toddler's eyes wandered curiously, unbothered by the tension, watching the ceiling fans turn lazily above and the light filtering through tall windows. At first, no one paid attention to the child. Why would they? This was a courtroom, a place for serious voices and official testimony, not for the chatter of toddlers. A 3-year-old could not possibly influence the outcome of a trial. To many present, the child was only there because the family had no other choice. They had brought them along out of necessity, not strategy. But quietly, the child observed everything. The case itself was already strange enough to draw media attention. At the heart of the matter was a police dog named Rex, a German shepherd trained to track suspects, detect narcotics, and protect officers in dangerous situations. He was well known in the community, often appearing at school demonstrations where children lined up to pet him, their parents snapping photos of the uniformed officers, proudly showing off their partner. To some, Rex was nearly a mascot, a symbol of trust in the police. Yet on one afternoon months earlier, something went wrong. An altercation between officers and a suspect spiraled out of control, and Rex was released to assist. But instead of restraining the suspect, the dog had allegedly turned its aggression toward bystanders, including the family now seated in court. The father had been injured, the mother terrified, and the child left with a memory they could not forget. The town had split over what happened. Supporters of the police argued that the family was exaggerating, that Rex was only doing his duty in a chaotic situation. Others insisted the attack was unjustifiable and dangerous, raising questions about training standards and accountability. For months, the story had simmered, whispered about in grocery stores, debated on local radio, and shared across social media. Now, all of it had come to a head in this trial. The judge entered, and the bailiff called the room to order. Everyone rose to their feet in solemn respect, the air crackling with anticipation. Once seated, the proceedings began. Opening statements framed the dog not just as an animal, but as a figure at the center of moral conflict. The defense painted Rex as a loyal servant of justice, a living tool trained to keep the community safe. The prosecution, however, framed him as a weapon misused, his bite leaving scars that could not be ignored. Through it all, the child sat quietly, legs dangling over the edge of the wooden bench. The little one's innocence contrasted so starkly with the grown-up seriousness of the trial that a few jurors glanced over from time to time, their expressions softening. Most people dismissed the toddler as a silent observer, a background detail in the larger drama. But in the stillness of that room, the child's presence carried an unspoken weight, as though something unexpected lingered beneath the surface. The journalists scribbled in their notebooks, focusing on the clash between attorneys and the testimony of experts. Reporters muttered about police credibility, about politics, about community trust. None of them thought to record the quiet yawns of a child, or the way the toddler's small hand clutched a toy car hidden in a pocket. Yet those details, overlooked and underestimated, would soon take on a significance that none of them could predict. For now, though, the trial moved forward with rigid formality. Witnesses described Rex's training, his loyalty, his record of service. Photographs were passed around, showing the injuries sustained during the incident. Each image sparked murmurs in the gallery, sympathy in some faces, skepticism in others. The defense objected frequently, the prosecution pressed harder, and the judge's gavel fell more than once to quiet the room. Still, in the midst of all this, the child sat and watched. Wide, innocent eyes blinked slowly, following the dog handler as he walked past, pausing at the sound of the gavel, reacting not to arguments or evidence, but to the simple human emotions filling the space: anger, fear, sadness, pride. It was as though the child was absorbing the trial in a way no adult could, without the filter of politics or procedure. By the time the first day's session neared its end, the courthouse was buzzing with tension. Everyone wondered how the jury would interpret the conflicting stories, how the judge would manage the storm of objections, and how the town would react to whatever verdict might eventually come. Few thought the smallest person in the room would play any role in shaping that outcome. And yet, even then, a sense of unease lingered in the air. Perhaps it was the way the toddler's gaze lingered on the officers. Perhaps it was the way the mother held the child so tightly, as if protecting them not from noise, but from memory. Or perhaps it was something deeper in intuition, shared silently by those who noticed the child's watchfulness. The courthouse was a place built for logic and law, for evidence and testimony. But sometimes, truth doesn't enter through official channels. Sometimes it arrives in the most unexpected form, in the smallest, quietest voice. And though no one yet realized it, the child seated in the gallery would soon become the heart of the story, the witness no one had anticipated, the presence that would turn a routine trial into something unforgettable. The courthouse rose above the town square like an old sentinel, its columns cracked but dignified, its flag tugged by a restless autumn wind. On most days, the building held quiet hearings, land disputes, traffic violations, the occasional burglary case. But today was different. A crowd that gathered outside was larger, louder, more restless. Inside, the gallery filled quickly, with townsfolk whispering as they slid onto polished benches that had absorbed decades of restless shifting. This was no ordinary trial. At the center of the case was not a man or woman, but a dog Rex, a German shepherd with a glossy black and tan coat and a reputation as both hero and menace. To some, Rex symbolized bravery. The police canine who had patrolled schools, sniffed out narcotics, and appeared in community demonstrations. Parents had snapped photos of their children standing beside him, smiling as an officer praised the dog's loyalty. To others, Rex symbolized fear, a weapon on four legs, unpredictable, capable of leaving lasting scars. Months earlier, an incident had shattered the town's easy trust in its police canine unit. What should have been a routine arrest had spun out of control. Rex, released to assist, had lunged not at the suspect but at bystanders. When the chaos ended, a man carried bite wounds, his wife trembled with shock, and their small child clung to them, crying in terror. That family, the victims in the case, now sat quietly in the courtroom, waiting for justice in a system that often seemed designed to protect authority. The father sat upright, jaw tight, hands folded rigidly in his lap. The mother held their 3-year-old child close, almost shielding the little one from the courtroom's heavy air. The child, wide-eyed and innocent, angled a toy car between small fingers, oblivious to the solemnity around them. No one in the room thought the toddler mattered. To most, the child was simply an accessory to the parents' ordeal, too young to understand the seriousness of the proceedings. And yet, the smallest presence in that room would soon become the most unforgettable. The defense attorney, a man with sharp cheekbones and sharper words, leaned back in his chair as if already confident in victory. His files were stacked in perfect order, each tab marked with precision. He planned to show the jury that Rex had acted within training, that the chaos of the day had forced the dog to respond instinctively, and that no fault could be placed on either the animal or his handler. At the prosecution's table sat a young woman, her brow furrowed, her notes scattered. She wasn't just here to win a case. She was here to prove that accountability applied even to those wearing badges or partnered with them. Her task was steep: convince the jury that loyalty to law enforcement must never outweigh justice for innocent families. When the judge entered, the room rose to its feet. The sound of the gavel striking wood echoed like thunder, silencing whispers. Court is now in session. From the moment opening statements began, the tension was palpable. The defense praised Rex's service record, describing him as a trusted guardian of this community. They reminded jurors of the children who had petted him, the drugs he had uncovered, the dangers he had neutralized. They used words like loyalty, duty, and sacrifice, carefully framing the animal as a hero who had been unfairly maligned. The prosecution painted a very different picture. They projected photographs of the father's injuries onto a large screen-deep puncture wounds, dark bruises spreading like ink. The gallery gasped softly. The prosecutor's voice trembled only slightly as she described how a routine afternoon turned into terror, how bystanders were attacked instead of protected. "This is not about loyalty," she told the jury. "This is about accountability. When a weapon, whether steel or flesh, causes harm to the innocent, responsibility must follow." The clash of narratives gripped everyone, yet the child in the gallery remained oddly calm. While lawyers raised their voices and jurors shifted uneasily, the toddler fiddled with the toy car, rolling it along the wooden bench, tapping its wheels softly. Every now and then, wide eyes looked up at the dog handler seated near the front, then drifted to the uniforms of officers lined along the side. The child didn't understand legal jargon, evidence, or objections, but absorbed the human energy in the room: anger, fear, defensiveness, pride. Most ignored the little one. A few jurors glanced over from time to time, momentarily disarmed by the sight of innocence in a place so heavy with conflict. But no one imagined the child would ever influence the trial's outcome. As testimony continued, experts described canine training protocols. Trainers explained how dogs were conditioned to obey, how their bites were calculated, not chaotic. Police officers swore Rex had never disobeyed commands before that day. Meanwhile, the prosecution pressed witnesses on inconsistencies. Was Rex released too early? Did the handler lose control? Could the dog truly distinguish threat from bystander? Each objection, each ruling, each cross-examination seemed to raise the temperature of the room. The gallery murmured in waves, shushed repeatedly by the bailiff. Some shook their heads in disbelief at the accusations. Others whispered angrily about police overreach. By late afternoon, it felt less like a trial and more like a community referendum on authority itself. And still, in the midst of it all, the toddler watched. The mother held her child tighter whenever the voices rose. The father's eyes flicked anxiously toward the jury box, then down at his child, as though silently begging the universe to recognize the truth of their suffering. The child, however, seemed to exist in a separate world, one where adults shouted words that carried little meaning, where the real memory was a flash of teeth, a terrifying bark, and the instinct to cry out. The reporters at the back scribbled furiously, crafting headlines they hoped would catch attention. Police dog on trial. Community divided. Hero or hazard. K-9 unit under fire. None thought to record the yawns of a toddler, or the way small fingers gripped the edge of the bench as if steadying against a storm. Yet those details dismissed as background would soon matter more than any quote. When the first day drew to a close, the courtroom exhaled as though it had been holding its breath. The judge reminded jurors not to discuss the case outside. The lawyers gathered their files, and townsfolk spilled into the evening air, continuing their debates on sidewalks and over diner counters. Inside, however, the family lingered a moment longer. The mother adjusted her grip on the sleepy child, brushing hair from a small forehead. The father looked back at the judge's bench, then down at his child. He didn't say it aloud, but his eyes betrayed the thought. Maybe the truth doesn't need to come from us. Maybe it will come from the one voice no one expects. For though the courthouse had been built for evidence and logic, its walls would soon echo with something far more powerful. Not the practiced rhetoric of attorneys, not the measured tone of witnesses, but the simplest words from the smallest presence. And when that moment came, it would shake the entire courtroom to its core. The family at the center of the case lived in the shadows of whispers long before they ever set foot in the courthouse. In a small town where everyone knew everyone, anonymity was impossible. Their names were repeated over cups of coffee, their story debated in grocery aisles, and their faces recognized in gas stations. Some neighbors offered sympathy. Others avoided eye contact, muttering that it was unwise to go against the police. Living under that constant scrutiny weighed heavily. But what burdened them most was not gossip or rumor. It was the memory of that single afternoon when their world shifted. It had begun like any other day. The father, Daniel, had taken his young daughter to a park not far from their home. The sun was out, children's laughter mingled with the creak of swings, and families gathered with picnic baskets. Daniel had always been cautious, never letting his little one out of arm's reach. That day, he remembered, was no different until the sirens wailed. Police vehicles had descended suddenly, chasing a suspect who darted recklessly across the park. Officers shouted, and confusion erupted. Parents scooped up their children, retreating to safety. Daniel pulled his daughter into his arms, watching the scene unfold. Then he saw the handler unleash Rex. The German shepherd charged forward with precision, powerful muscles rippling under his coat. But instead of veering toward the suspect, Rex turned abruptly, his sharp focus locking on to the crowd. Daniel barely had time to react before the dog lunged. Teeth sank into his arm, and he felt fire shoot through his nerves. He tried to shield his daughter, twisting his body, yelling for help. The child screamed, a raw, piercing sound that would echo in Daniel's mind for months afterward. Officers rushed in, pulling Rex back, shouting contradictory commands. The handler insisted the dog was confused by the chaos, but Daniel's family saw something more sinister. A weapon out of control, aimed not at criminals, but at innocents. That night, in the emergency room, while his wound was stitched, Daniel sat silent as his wife, Emily, clutched their daughter tightly. The child refused to let go of her mother's neck, trembling long after the danger had passed. Emily whispered reassurances, but inside, she was consumed by fear, not just of the dog, but of what would follow. Her fears proved correct. The days after the attack blurred into a haze of medical bills, police reports, and unwanted attention. Officers came to the hospital, some apologetic, others defensive. These things happen, one muttered, as though the bite were nothing more than a workplace accident. The police department issued a brief statement praising Rex's years of service, calling the incident regrettable but understandable. That phrase, understandable, burned in Emily's chest. How could anyone find her husband's injuries or her child's terror understandable? At home, the struggle deepened. Daniel, once strong and confident, moved stiffly, his injured arm wrapped and sore. He avoided mirrors, not wanting to see the angry marks that reminded him daily of his helplessness. Nights were worse. Their daughter would wake crying, clutching at shadows, mumbling in half-sleep about barking and teeth. Emily often held her until dawn, whispering, "You're safe, baby. You're safe," though she herself felt anything but safe. Friends came by less frequently. Some avoided the family altogether, unwilling to be seen taking sides. Others dropped off casseroles or kind words, but their support carried an edge of pity. More than once, Emily overheard neighbors whispering, "Why didn't he move faster? Why take a child near the commotion?" As if the attack had been their fault. The family's decision to pursue legal action was not immediate. For weeks they hesitated, weighed down by doubt. The police were powerful, respected. Who were they to challenge authority? Daniel worried about his job, about being branded a troublemaker. Emily feared retaliation, subtle or otherwise. Yet each night, as she soothed her trembling child, she grew more certain. Silence would mean complicity. Someone had to speak for the innocent. Hiring a lawyer brought both relief and fear. The attorney warned them, "This will not be easy. The department will fight. The community may turn against you." Still, the family agreed. The scars on Daniel's arm were evidence enough, but the deeper wound lay in the small voice that sometimes whispered from their daughter's lips. "Bad dog." 2 simple words, repeated in the dark, words the child did not fully understand, but could not forget. In the weeks leading to the trial, their home felt like a fortress under siege. Reporters knocked at their door, asking for comments. Strangers on social media accused them of trying to ruin the career of a decorated K-9. Letters arrived in their mailbox, some supportive, others venomous. "You should be ashamed," one note scrawled in shaky handwriting read. Emily folded it carefully and tucked it away, unwilling to let her daughter ever see it. Through it all, the toddler remained oddly steady. Children have a resilience adults envy, and she carried on with her play, her laughter returning in brief bursts between shadows of memory. But Emily noticed things others would miss. The way her daughter froze at the sound of barking in the distance. The way she clung tighter in crowded places. The way her small voice would whisper "bad dog" when nightmares pulled her awake. Daniel wrestled with guilt. He replayed the moment in the park countless times, wondering if he could have shielded his family better, if he could have run faster, shouted louder, done anything different. He hated himself for feeling powerless, for failing the people he loved most. At night, when Emily asked what he was thinking, he often shook his head. "Nothing," he lied, though inside the weight pressed heavier. The closer the trial loomed, the more isolated they felt. Emily noticed how officers avoided their eyes in town. Daniel's co-workers grew distant, conversations shifting awkwardly when he entered the room. The family became symbols heroes to some, betrayers to others. All they wanted was to be seen as human, as victims of a mistake that should never have happened. On the first morning of the trial, Emily dressed her daughter in a pale yellow dress, one of the few untouched by the chaos of recent months. The child clutched her toy car, her constant companion, as if it were armor. Daniel wore a suit that felt stiff, his injured arm still aching when he moved too quickly. As they walked into the courthouse, whispers followed them like shadows. Inside, seated on the wooden bench, Emily felt the weight of the room pressing down. She knew the lawyers would argue fiercely, knew the evidence would be scrutinized, knew her husband would be cross-examined until his voice cracked. What she didn't know, what no one could predict, was how her daughter, the smallest and most underestimated presence in the room, would shift the trial in a way that no lawyer, no witness, no strategy ever could. For though the family had carried their silent struggle for months, their child carried something even more powerful, the truth, distilled to its simplest form, waiting to slip through tiny lips at the most unexpected moment. And when that truth surfaced, it would not be dismissed. The trial gained momentum as soon as witnesses began to testify. What had once seemed like a surreal spectacle, a courtroom filled with lawyers, police officers, journalists, and a toddler hardened into something much heavier. This was no longer about gossip whispered in diners or speculation traded at barbershops. It was about evidence, testimony, and a jury tasked with deciding whether a police dog had become a weapon instead of a protector. From the start, the prosecution made clear that this case wasn't about hatred of law enforcement. It was about accountability. Their lead attorney, a woman named Claire Jennings, stood before the jury with her shoulders squared and her voice steady. She explained that while Rex had been trained to assist, the responsibility lay with the department and the handler. When we unleash a tool of enforcement, she said, we are responsible for how it's used. A dog is not a scapegoat. A dog is not an excuse. A dog, like a gun or a baton, is an extension of the officer's authority. And when it harms the innocent, accountability must follow. Her words hung in the air, drawing murmurs from the gallery. She continued, methodically outlining the events of the park incident, describing Daniel's injuries, and pointing to the trauma carried by Emily and their daughter. She promised the jury they would hear from medical professionals, eyewitnesses, and even experts in canine behavior. Each piece of testimony, she insisted, would prove one thing, that what happened that day was preventable. The defense responded with equal force. Their lead attorney, Mark Stanton, approached the jury with a different angle. Where Claire's tone was sharp and unyielding, Mark's was smooth, almost soothing. He reminded the jury of Rex's years of service, his decorated history in drug detection and search and rescue. This is a dog that has saved lives, he declared. He is not a monster. He is not a liability. He is a hero. Mark acknowledged the injuries but framed them as tragic accidents, the unfortunate result of a chaotic scene where suspects, bystanders, and officers all collided in confusion. Do not let sympathy cloud judgment, he told the jury. We cannot punish loyalty. We cannot punish instinct. And we cannot punish a family pet for doing the job he was trained to do. The jury listened, their faces unreadable. Some leaned forward, interested. Others sat back, arms crossed. The division in the town mirrored itself in the 12 people tasked with rendering a verdict. The first witnesses were police officers, called by the defense. They described Rex as disciplined, reliable, and fearless. One officer, a veteran of 20 years, recounted how the dog had cornered a burglary suspect in a warehouse, preventing harm to both officers and civilians. Another described Rex finding a missing child in the woods within hours. Their testimonies were moving, even inspiring. To many listening, Rex sounded less like an animal and more like a guardian angel on 4 legs. But the prosecution was ready. Claire Jennings cross-examined each officer carefully, pressing them on details of Rex's training. Isn't it true, she asked one handler, that Rex had a history of what trainers call overbite incidents, times when he failed to release immediately on command? The officer hesitated before conceding that yes, there had been such reports. Though they had been minor, Claire seized on the hesitation. Minor to you, she said, but not minor to the man sitting in this courtroom with scars on his arm. The tension rose with each exchange. Supporters of the police shifted uncomfortably in the gallery, while others nodded in quiet agreement with Claire's relentless questions. Medical testimony followed. A doctor displayed photographs of Daniel's wounds, explaining the depth of the punctures, the risk of infection, and the long recovery required. He noted that the scarring was permanent and that nerve damage had left Daniel with lingering weakness in his hand. The jury winced at the images, some averting their eyes. The defense tried to minimize the severity. Bite wounds heal, Mark Stanton argued during cross-examination. They are painful, yes, but they are not uncommon in law enforcement situations. Isn't it true that Mr. Rivera, he gestured toward Daniel, has already regained most of his function? The doctor agreed that some healing had occurred, but he added firmly, the trauma is not only physical. The psychological impact, especially on a family, can last a lifetime. It was then that Emily's quiet presence in the courtroom became impossible to ignore. Each time testimony mentioned her child, she tightened her arms around the little one, as if shielding her from invisible blows. The jury noticed. So did the reporters. The image of a mother holding her child in a courtroom while listening to clinical descriptions of blood and teeth was too striking to forget. The prosecution's most powerful moment came when an expert in canine behavior took the stand. Dr. Leonard Harris, a soft-spoken man with decades of experience, explained that while police dogs could be highly effective, they were not machines. They are animals, he said plainly. They can misinterpret cues. They can act on instinct rather than command, particularly in chaotic environments. He paused before adding, and when you place them in public spaces, around families and children, the risk multiplies. What happened in that park was not just an accident. It was predictable. The defense tried to discredit him, pointing out that he had never worked directly with Rex. But Dr. Harris held firm, reminding the court that training logs and prior reports told their own story. The signs were there, he said. They were ignored. By the end of his testimony, the courtroom was buzzing. Some officers glared at him. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Through it all, the child remained a quiet shadow in the gallery. She colored on a scrap of paper with a borrowed pen, humming softly to herself. Most dismissed her as too young to understand the gravity of what unfolded around her. Yet her presence lingered in the back of every juror's mind, like a symbol of what was truly at stake. As the day wore on, the arguments grew sharper. Mark Stanton objected repeatedly, accusing the prosecution of appealing to emotion rather than fact. Claire Jennings countered with precision, insisting that facts and emotions could not be separated when lives were harmed. The judge's gavel struck again and again, restoring order but never easing the tension. When court recessed for the evening, people spilled into the streets outside, still arguing in clusters. Supporters of the police shook their heads angrily, muttering about witch hunts. Others murmured about accountability and responsibility. Reporters filed stories with dramatic headlines, and the town braced for more fireworks in the days ahead. But inside the Rivera household that night, the silence was heavy. Daniel sat at the table, his arm throbbing, his face pale. Emily rocked their daughter to sleep, whispering lullabies as the child clutched her toy car. When the girl finally drifted off, Emily laid her gently in bed, then returned to Daniel. "She keeps saying it," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Bad dog." Over and over. She doesn't understand what's happening, but she knows. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "I don't want her dragged into this," he muttered. "She's just a baby. She shouldn't have to carry this." Emily's eyes filled with tears. She already is. Neither of them knew then that their child's innocent. Repetition of those words would soon escape the safety of their home and enter the courtroom itself forever, altering the course of the trial. The third day of the trial dawned gray and unsettled, with rain clouds clinging to the horizon. The courthouse, usually a backdrop to routine disputes and procedural hearings, had taken on the air of a theater, its steps crowded with reporters and curious townsfolk who clutched umbrellas and exchanged hurried updates. Inside, however, the tension was heavier than the weather. It wasn't just the fate of a police dog on trial anymore. It was the credibility of the system itself. The courtroom filled quickly. Officers in uniform occupied the left side of the gallery, a wall of authority and loyalty. On the right sat townspeople sympathetic to Daniel and Emily Rivera, whispering among themselves as they cast glances at the couple and their small child. At the center, presiding over it all, was Judge Harold Whitaker, a man whose decades on the bench had taught him to balance patience with authority. His thinning gray hair and stern jawline gave him the look of someone carved out of the very oak that lined the courtroom walls. For 2 days, Whitaker had listened to clashing narratives: loyalty versus accountability, heroism versus recklessness. He'd ruled on objections, managed tempers, and reminded both attorneys that his courtroom was not a stage for theatrics. But beneath his stoic exterior, he felt the weight of the town's eyes pressing down on him. Whatever decision the jury eventually made, people would remember his role. He couldn't afford missteps. That morning, as the session began, the defense requested that the Rivera child not be allowed inside. Mark Stanton, his voice smooth as ever, stood before the bench and said, "Your Honor, this is a highly sensitive environment. We are dealing with graphic evidence, complex testimony, and the presence of a 3-year-old is frankly disruptive and inappropriate. The child cannot contribute meaningfully to the proceedings, and their presence risks influencing the jury with emotion rather than fact." The gallery stirred. A few officers nodded in agreement, while others in the community section whispered angrily. Emily's face flushed as she clutched her daughter tighter, her eyes darting to Daniel for reassurance. The child, perched on her lap, swung her toy car back and forth, oblivious to the storm swirling around her. Claire Jennings was on her feet instantly. "Your Honor," she countered, "the Riveras have no one else to care for their daughter during these proceedings. They are entitled to be present for their own case. To deny them that right simply because they are parents would be unfair and, frankly, unjust. This child has already endured the trauma at the heart of this case. To exclude her now would punish the family further." The judge leaned back, rubbing his temple with his thumb. He had anticipated this issue, but he hadn't expected it to ignite so soon. On one hand, he agreed with Stanton. A toddler in a courtroom was far from ideal. They could cry, distract, or worse, sway a jury with innocence that had no bearing on law. On the other hand, Jennings was right. Family members had a right to attend, and he could not strip that away lightly. The bailiff coughed softly, awaiting instruction. The jury looked expectant, their eyes darting between the attorneys and the judge. Every decision in this case seemed amplified, magnified by the presence of reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks. Whitaker knew that whatever he ruled now would be printed in tomorrow's headlines. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Mr. Stanton, your concerns are duly noted. However, this court cannot bar the Riveras from attending their own trial simply because they are parents. The child may remain." Stanton's lips tightened, but he inclined his head respectfully. Jennings exhaled softly, a flicker of relief crossing her face. Emily squeezed her daughter closer, whispering something into her ear. The judge wasn't finished. He pointed his gavel toward both attorneys. "But let me be clear. This child is not to be treated as a participant in these proceedings. There will be no attempts to involve her in testimony, no gestures designed to draw attention to her. She is here only as a passive observer, nothing more." "Understood?" Both sides nodded, though Stanton's agreement carried the stiffness of defeat. Court resumed, but the ripple of the decision lingered. The jury kept stealing glances at the small girl, now contentedly humming to herself. The defense lawyers frowned, knowing even unspoken innocence could leave an imprint. The prosecution, though silent, felt a quiet surge of confidence. Presence alone had power. As testimony continued, Whitaker found his gaze drifting toward the child. She was so small against the backdrop of towering shelves, solemn portraits of past judges, and heavy mahogany furniture. The courtroom was a place built for men and women, hardened by conflict and law. Yet here sat a child, dangling her legs, unaware that her very existence unsettled seasoned attorneys. At recess, Whitaker retreated to his chambers, pacing before his desk. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stared out the rain-streaked window. In his career, he had presided over murder trials, corruption cases, and bitter custody battles. He thought he had seen everything, but never had he felt so conflicted about something so seemingly small. A child in the courtroom, what harm could it do? Yet deep down, he sensed that her presence was not trivial. It was like a stone dropped into still water, its ripples expanding outward, unseen but unstoppable. Back in the courtroom, tensions mounted. Claire Jennings called another witness, an eyewitness from the park. The woman described the chaos in vivid detail, the suspect running, the officers shouting, and then Rex breaking free, lunging not at the suspect, but toward the bystanders. Her voice cracked as she recalled Emily's scream and the child's shrill cry. The gallery shifted uneasily, and the jury's eyes darted instinctively toward the little girl. She was silent, but her very presence was like a living reminder of the story being told. The defense objected repeatedly, claiming emotional manipulation. Whitaker overruled most objections, though each one tugged at his conscience. Was the child influencing the jury? Was he allowing sentiment to bleed into law? When the day's proceedings ended, Whitaker lingered on the bench as the courtroom emptied. The Riveras shuffled out slowly, their daughter perched on Daniel's hip, clutching her toy car. Stanton packed his files with tight, angry motions. Reporters rushed out, eager to file their stories. Only when the room was nearly empty did Whitaker exhale. He tapped his gavel against the desk softly, not as a command, but as a rhythm, a habit he had developed when deep in thought. His mind churned with doubts. He had allowed the child to stay. He had given in to what felt, in the moment, like fairness. But would history judge him as weak? Would tomorrow's papers paint him as a man who let a toddler tilt the scales of justice? That night, as he sat in his study at home, Whitaker reread his notes from the day. The words blurred, overshadowed by the image of the child in her mother's arms, small and unassuming, yet somehow central to everything. He told himself he had made the right call. He told himself she was just an observer. But deep down, he knew the truth. No one that innocent could ever be a passive presence in a room where justice hung by a thread. And soon, despite his best efforts, the child's voice would pierce the very silence he worked so hard to maintain. The silence in the courtroom was unlike anything anyone had ever felt there before. It wasn't the silence of boredom or fatigue, the kind that drifted in during long testimony. It was a heavy, living stillness, as though the very air was waiting. Jurors sat stiffly in their chairs. Lawyers froze mid-motion, their pens hovering above yellow pads. Even the judge, normally quick to break quiet with his gavel, sat back in his chair, hands gripping the armrests, eyes fixed on the small child in the gallery. Emily whispered her daughter's name again, gently tugging her hand, but the little girl didn't move. Her gaze remained fixed on the front of the courtroom, on the polished wood floor where officers had testified and witnesses had broken down in tears. Her lips trembled, then steadied. She inhaled, tiny shoulders rising, and in a voice both fragile and piercing, she spoke, "Bad dog." 2 words. That was all. But they carried like thunder. The sound seemed to echo in the chamber, though her voice had been soft, almost conversational. People blinked, as if they hadn't truly heard it. A reporter's pen slipped from her hand, clattering loudly against the floor, breaking the stunned quiet. Somewhere in the gallery, a woman gasped sharply, the sound cutting through the stillness like a knife. Judge Whitaker's heart jolted in his chest. He leaned forward instinctively, his gavel half raised, though he couldn't bring himself to strike it. He looked at the child, her small, round face, her wide eyes, her innocence, and then at the jury. Some of them had gone pale. Others looked away, staring down at their hands as though the weight of those words were too much. At the plaintiff's table, Daniel Rivera shut his eyes, his jaw tightening. He hadn't wanted this. He hadn't wanted his little girl dragged into the machinery of law and spectacle. But he knew there was no taking it back now. Emily clutched her daughter, murmuring quickly in her ear, trying to soothe her. But the words had already escaped, and they now belonged to the courtroom. Mark Stanton, the defense attorney, was the first to recover. He shot to his feet, voice ringing louder than usual. "Objection," he barked. "This is highly improper. The child is not a witness. She is not competent to testify. This is emotional manipulation of the worst kind." His words spilled out too quickly, like a man drowning and grasping for anything to hold on to. Claire Jennings rose calmly but firmly. "Your Honor, the child spoke on her own. No one prompted her. No one asked her a question. What you heard was the unfiltered recollection of a 3-year-old and innocent observer whose memory of that day remains pure." The judge finally struck his gavel, its sharp crack startling everyone back into motion. "Enough," he commanded. "The jury will disregard what they just heard. The child is not a sworn witness, and her words are not evidence." But even as he said it, Whitaker knew the futility of his order. He could tell them to disregard. He could instruct them to ignore. But he could not erase the sound of those 2 words from their minds. No one could. The jury exchanged furtive glances. A few scribbled notes. One woman pressed a hand to her chest, as though steadying herself. Another leaned back, arms crossed, staring at the ceiling as if grappling with the impossible task of erasing what had just happened. The gallery buzzed in low murmurs, spreading outward like ripples on water. Reporters bent close to their keyboards, typing furiously. One whispered to another, "That's the headline right there." Officers in uniform shifted uncomfortably, some frowning, others clenching their jaws in frustration. Stanton pressed on, voice rising. "Your Honor, I move for a mistrial. This proceeding has been irreparably tainted. The jury has been poisoned by an outburst that should never have been allowed in this courtroom." The words, mistrial, struck the room like another blow. Gasps broke out. Whitaker banged his gavel again, harder this time. "Order," he thundered. "This is my courtroom, and I will not have it turned into a circus." He glared at Stanton, then at Jennings, and finally at the Riveras. Emily's face was streaked with silent tears. The child had tucked her head against her mother's shoulder, unaware of the storm she had unleashed. Whitaker's mind raced. A mistrial would tear the town apart. It would confirm the whispers that justice bent under pressure. Yet to proceed without acknowledging the disruption felt equally dangerous. The balance he had fought to maintain now wobbled precariously, 2 words away from collapse. After a long silence, he spoke. "The motion for mistrial is denied. The jury has been instructed to disregard the outburst, and I trust them to follow the law. We will proceed." Stanton's jaw tightened, but he sat slowly, his eyes flashing with frustration. Jennings remained standing for a moment, her gaze steady on the jury. She hadn't spoken since the objection, but she didn't need to. The damage or the truth was already planted. The rest of the day's testimony limped forward, but the rhythm was gone. Witnesses spoke, but the jury seemed distracted. Their pens scratched mechanically, their faces distant. The defense presented expert testimony on canine training, but the words fell flat. The prosecution called another eyewitness, but her account seemed drowned beneath the echo of the child's voice. For the Riveras, the day was a blur. Emily rocked her daughter gently, whispering lullabies even in the courtroom, as though trying to quiet not only her child, but the memory of her words. Daniel stared ahead, expression unreadable, though his clenched fists betrayed the storm inside him. When the gavel finally struck to end the session, the gallery erupted in chatter. Reporters bolted for the doors, racing to broadcast the moment to the world. "Bad dog," they repeated over and over, as though rehearsing the phrase for print. By evening, the words would appear on every news ticker, every radio report, every social media post. Outside, cameras flashed as the Riveras left the courthouse. Emily shielded her daughter's face, but microphones shoved forward, voices calling out. What did she mean? Did you teach her to say it? Is this your strategy? Daniel pushed through the crowd silently, jaw tight, refusing to answer. Inside his chambers, Judge Whitaker slumped into his chair, his head in his hands. He had denied the mistrial, but he knew the truth. The trial had changed forever. The jury might try to follow his instructions, but those two words would linger like a ghost in the room, whispering louder than any testimony. And as the courthouse lights dimmed that evening, the entire town buzzed with one simple question. Had justice just been spoken through the mouth of a child? The courthouse emptied that evening, but the words remained. Bad dog, 2 syllables spoken by a child, had spread faster than any testimony, any photograph, any carefully prepared argument. By the time Judge Whitaker locked his chambers and stepped into the rain-soaked streets, the phrase was already echoing across town like the refrain of a song no one could forget. Outside the courthouse, clusters of people gathered in heated conversation. Some shook their heads angrily, muttering about manipulation. That's not evidence, one man snapped, his voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd. You can't let a toddler decide a case like this. Others nodded, agreeing with equal passion. Innocence speaks the truth, a woman countered. She saw what we didn't, and she said it plain. No lawyer could twist it. Cameras panned across faces lit by street lamps, catching the fervor. Reporters stood on makeshift platforms, microphones in hand, feeding the moment live to evening news anchors. Within hours, the story broke statewide. By dawn, it had gone national. Headlines screamed across television screens. Toddler's words stun courtroom in canine trial. 3-year-old becomes voice in controversial case. Innocence versus authority. A town divided. On social media, the phrase bad dog trended globally. Memes appeared within hours, some sympathetic, others mocking. Hashtags split users into camps. Hashtag justice for Riveras. Hashtag stand by Rex. Hashtag bad dog trial. What had been a local trial now exploded into a cultural flashpoint, debated by strangers thousands of miles away. Inside the Rivera home, the impact was immediate and overwhelming. Daniel turned off the television after seeing his daughter's face blurred on the evening news. But the reporters camped outside their driveway made privacy impossible. Emily drew the curtains, rocking her daughter and whispering prayers for peace. The little girl, too young to understand, asked why people outside kept shouting her words. Because they were brave words, Emily told her softly. Because sometimes the smallest voice makes the loudest sound. In the police department, the mood was equally tense. Officers who had once spoken proudly of Rex now avoided the subject in public, wary of fueling the fire. Some muttered about betrayal, their trust in the town crumbling. Others defended the Riveras quietly, recognizing the pain of the family. Rex himself kept kenneled at the station, barked anxiously at anyone who passed, unaware that his fate now hung in balance. The following day in court, the atmosphere was electric. Reporters packed the gallery wall to wall, their equipment crowding the aisles. Members of the public filled every bench, their faces tight with anticipation. The jury filed in silently, their expressions unreadable, but their glances toward the child betrayed the memory of the day before. Judge Whitaker struck his gavel with unusual force, his voice carrying a note of strain. "Let me remind everyone in this courtroom," he declared, "that we are here to deliberate evidence, not outbursts. What occurred yesterday was irregular, and you are instructed once again to disregard it in your considerations." But even as he spoke, he knew the futility of his words. The silence that followed wasn't one of obedience. It was one of doubt. The defense tried desperately to regain control of the narrative. Stanton stood before the jury with renewed vigor, his tone sharp. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this case has veered dangerously off course. Are we truly prepared to let the future of justice rest on the words of a child who cannot distinguish memory from imagination? What you heard yesterday was not testimony. It was noise. And if you allow noise to dictate judgment, you betray the very oath you swore as jurors." His voice rose as he gestured toward Emily and the child. "Sympathy is natural, but sympathy is not justice. Justice requires discipline, evidence, and the strength to separate fact from feeling." For a moment, his words seemed to land. The jury shifted uncomfortably, some nodding faintly. Stanton straightened, sensing momentum. But then Jennings rose. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply walked to the center of the courtroom, hands folded before her, and spoke with quiet conviction. No one asked that child to speak. No one prompted her. And yet, in a moment of silence, she remembered. She remembered what she saw, what she felt, and she named it. 2 words, simple, honest, untouched by training, politics, or fear. That is not noise. That is truth. She paused, letting the quiet return. The jury watched her, rapt. Reporters typed furiously. Even Stanton, lips pressed into a hard line, remained frozen in place. "This trial has been about responsibility," Jennings continued. "The responsibility of a department to protect its citizens. The responsibility of officers to control the tools they unleash. And yes, the responsibility of all of us to listen when even the smallest voice dares to speak. We can argue protocols, we can debate training, we can hide behind technicalities. But sometimes, the truth is spoken so plainly that it cannot be ignored. And yesterday, you heard it. The silence that followed was heavier than applause, heavier than protest. It was the silence of acknowledgement. Whitaker struck his gavel quickly, his tone stern. "That is enough. Counsel will restrict themselves to evidence." Yet even as he reprimanded her, a flicker of something passed across his face, resignation perhaps, or acceptance. He knew what everyone else did. The words had become part of the trial, whether he admitted it or not. Through the rest of the day, the trial struggled to proceed as if nothing had changed. Witnesses gave testimony. Experts sparred, but their voices seemed distant. The jury's pens moved mechanically, yet their minds lingered elsewhere. Every argument was now measured against the echo of 2 words. Every photograph, every logbook, every shouted objection seemed smaller in comparison. When the session ended, the gallery erupted again. Reporters rushing for exits, microphones extended toward anyone connected to the case. Outside, chants broke out in dueling rhythms. "Justice for Rivera's," answered by "Stand by Rex." The courthouse steps became a battleground of slogans and signs, each side certain it held the moral ground. That night, television pundits debated the case like a national referendum. Some praised the child's honesty, calling her a symbol of innocence piercing corruption. Others decried it as manipulation, a dangerous precedent for justice. If we let toddlers decide trials, one commentator sneered, why have courts at all? But beneath the noise, in the quiet corners of living rooms and kitchens across America, people leaned toward the television with furrowed brows and whispered to one another, what if she was right? Back in his chambers, Judge Whittaker sat alone, the courthouse dark around him. He rubbed his temples, replaying the day's arguments. He had tried to dismiss the words, to force them out of the record, but they had become something larger than the law itself. They had become belief. And belief, he knew, could move mountains sometimes faster than justice ever could. The final day of the trial dawned gray and restless. Rain fell in a thin drizzle, coating the courthouse steps where reporters had already staked their claim, their umbrellas a patchwork of colors against the gloom. Protesters gathered too, their chants competing with the weather. Some carried signs with Rex's picture and the words hero, not criminal. Others held placards declaring justice for Sophia, her toddler face sketched in soft lines by sympathetic hands. Inside, the atmosphere was stifling. The jury had spent 3 long days behind closed doors, their deliberations shielded from the public. Every hour of waiting felt like another stone added to the chest of those who had lived this case so personally. The Riveras sat together, Daniel's hand firmly gripping Emily's, while their daughter slept across her mother's lap, oblivious to the storm her words had unleashed. When the jury finally filed back into the courtroom, a hush descended. The shuffle of their shoes on the wooden floorboards sounded louder than any gavel. Judge Whittaker, his face drawn with fatigue, asked the foreperson to rise. "Have you reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." The words carried a weight that bent the air. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, unfolded the slip of paper and read aloud. "In the case of the state versus the city K-9 unit, we find the defendant Rex responsible for excessive force, and by extension, the department guilty of negligence." Gasps filled the room. Emily pressed her daughter closer, tears spilling down her cheeks. Daniel closed his eyes, whispering a prayer of gratitude. On the opposite side, Stanton's face hardened, his jaw locked in silent fury. Several officers in the gallery muttered angrily, while Jennings simply lowered her head, relief washing across her features. The judge raised his gavel, but hesitated before striking it. His voice, though steady, carried a tremor of gravity. "The jury has spoken. This verdict does not erase pain, nor does it condemn loyalty. It is, however, a reminder that no institution, no tool of justice, is above accountability. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down like thunder. The aftermath was immediate and ferocious. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, microphones extended toward anyone remotely connected to the case. Daniel and Emily, carrying their daughter between them, were escorted out a side door by deputies to avoid the chaos, though even their cameras snapped and questions flew. "Do you feel vindicated? What do you say to those who call this manipulation? Will you seek damages against the department?" Daniel said nothing. He simply raised a hand to shield his daughter's face and guided his family into the waiting car. The police department issued a press statement within hours, a somber declaration acknowledging the verdict, but defending Rex's training. "Our canine officers are critical to community safety," the statement read. "While we respect the jury's decision, we maintain that Rex acted according to his conditioning. We will review protocols to ensure incidents like this never occur again." But the words rang hollow against the tide of public opinion. National networks devoted prime-time coverage to the trial. Experts dissected every moment, from the bloody photographs to the toddler's words. One commentator called the verdict a watershed moment for accountability in policing, while another dismissed it as a dangerous surrender to emotion over fact. Editorials filled newspaper columns, debating the balance between law, perception, and innocence. And through it all, the phrase persisted. Bad dog. Simple, uncheckable, undeniable. It was painted on protest signs, printed on T-shirts, even whispered as shorthand in political debates. To some, it symbolized corruption. To others, betrayal. But no one could ignore it. For the Riveras, life did not immediately return to peace. Their home became both sanctuary and spotlight, a place where sympathy cards arrived in one envelope and threats in another. Emily kept Sophia close, wary of cameras that seemed to lurk behind every hedge. Daniel returned to work cautiously, greeted by some with support and by others with cold avoidance. Yet amidst the turbulence, something remarkable emerged. Letters poured in from across the country, written by families who had suffered quietly, their voices overlooked. Your daughter spoke for all of us, one letter read. Another, sometimes truth only comes from those too young to fear the cost. Emily saved each letter in a shoebox, tucking it under Sophia's bed as a reminder that her daughter's small voice had carried far. Meanwhile, Rex's fate became the subject of fierce debate. Animal rights advocates argued he should not bear the burden of human negligence, campaigning for his retirement to a safe home rather than termination. Officers, however, rallied to keep him active, insisting his removal would weaken morale and erode trust in the unit. In the end, a compromise was reached. Rex would be retired early, transferred to live with one of his longtime handlers. The decision was bittersweet. To some, it was mercy. To others, betrayal. But for Rex, it was simply a shift from courthouse symbol to household pet. Judge Whitaker, who had presided over the storm, remained haunted by it. In interviews weeks later, he admitted the trial had tested him like none before. The law is built on evidence, he said, but the human heart is built on truth. Sometimes the two meet. Sometimes they collide. My duty is to the law, but I will not pretend. I did not feel the weight of that child's words. His candor only deepened the public's fascination. Months passed, and the frenzy dimmed, though it never disappeared entirely. The Riveras found a new rhythm, their days quieter, their nights less restless. Sophia, still too young to grasp the magnitude of her words, returned to playgrounds and bedtime stories, her innocence mercifully preserved. Yet every so often, strangers stopped the family in public, some offering blessings, others arguments. Through it all, Daniel and Emily held firm. They shielded their daughter where they could, reminded her often that her words had mattered, and prayed she would not carry the burden of them too heavily into her future. Years later, the case remained a landmark, cited in debates over police accountability and the role of public perception in justice. Scholars wrote papers about it. Documentarians sought interviews. And in classrooms, law students studied the transcripts, grappling with the question, did justice prevail, or was it swayed by innocence? But for those who lived it, the answer lay not in academic debate. It lay in a moment when a courtroom grew silent, when a child's voice pierced the noise, and when two words shifted the course of a trial and a town. In the end, it was not the photographs, not the expert witnesses, not even the verdict that people remembered most. It was the echo of a little girl, speaking without agenda, without fear, naming the truth as she saw it. 2 words, 2 syllables, enough to remind the world that sometimes justice listens not to the loudest, but to the purest.